This is kind of about the implications of your work, and for people who are interested in reconstructing the historical Jesus, such as myself. And so seeing your work has been challenging in this respect, but I got to ask you about it. So
Sure.
on the last page of your book, you write, quote, "But if we treat the gospel authors as authors with artistic license, we must contend with the possibility that these are writers acting as writers. This means that it is possible, even likely, that a good portion of what we read when we read the Gospels is invention or part of a broader literary tradition." End quote. So I'm curious, why do you think it is plausible that much of the Gospel material is invented or incorporating Greco-Roman topoi in a distinctly ahistorical way? And again,
Yeah.
related to this with the context, when historians read other Greco-Roman biographies, such as from Xenophon or Plutarch or Suetonius, do they similarly think that a good portion is fictional? I'm not sure, because you're the classicist here, so I got to ask you.
So yeah, it's a great question, and I'll try not to get too like theoretical. So the quick answer to it is that what we consider historical is very different from what people thought was historical in antiquity, and we're super careful about like something has to be true and you have to prove it, and fiction is different from nonfiction, and we have all of these categories and these ideas about how that's supposed to work. That Those ideas are out there in antiquity, but they're not as cut and dry. Like even the concept of a genre of literature is really more of a modern construction than an ancient one. So when it came to history, and you mentioned Plutarch, who I mentioned in the book as well in my last chapter, so he's an easy one for me to go to. But I'm also thinking about some of the historians I've mentioned in this conversation, like Herodotus. So first of all, I should just kind of get out of the way that everyone accuses everyone else in antiquity of lying. Like that's kind of like the go-to because you want someone to read your version. You don't want them to read the other version. And like, particularly if you don't like someone, you're going to be like, well, that guy was lying, about this or that. And then it's easier for us to see how much what I call invention are in some of these other texts, because they'll tell us things that we just know now are completely not true, or like really stretch credulity, and some of them are really like the most obvious ones are really kind of awful, but they'll make claims about people with faces that grow out of their chest in a particular region of the world, like basically what we would call like monstrous kind of ideas. And they can make those claims about far off places in the empire because, or, elsewhere in the world, because nobody's going to go out there, nobody's going to see it. Or you can make claims about natural disasters, like think about the idea of what's Plato's fake. What's that place that was supposed to be like covered by the ocean that Plato talks about? It's not Olympus because that's the mountain, but you know what I mean. Like there would be like fantastic places that these people would talk about that are not.
Oh, Atlantis?
Atlantis.
Yeah.
Yeah, like yeah, that didn't exist, right? So you could make these kinds of claims, and then like someone would come along later and be like, well, that guy was lying about this, right? So those kinds of claims are out there all the time. I think what happens is we tend to give a little bit more latitude to the gospel writers than maybe we should. And this was kind of what I was getting at, because like even someone like Plutarch, when he's writing about Alexander, that's like 400 years or something, like centuries after Alexander was alive. And he did his best, and he kind of tells you like I'm trying to reconstruct this the best I can, but he also tells us, I'm not going to try to get into like the great battles that he fought and like the this and that and like minute details of these things. I'm here to just give you an impression of what this guy was like. So I'm going to tell you some little stories that are like almost like anecdotes about this guy, and that'll give you a sense of his character, because that's why you're reading this. And many other authors would do things like this in terms of saying like Alexander was really born from like a snake. Like nobody believes that. You know what I mean? Like when it's not about Christianity and it's about another first century text or figure, we tend to understand when history doesn't really apply in the same way, and we're more
Wait,
understanding.
sorry, if I can interrupt. Interestingly, a lot of apologists they'll point to Plutarch's biography of Alexander, and they'll say this is 400 years after Alexander died, but historians still trust this, which is a little misleading because, I heard this, and then I heard two students from Duke University say, go ahead and just read it. Like, read it and see if everything is clearly historical. And then on the first page, it's Alexander. There's divine conception, and then there are omens, that kind of foreshadow his birth, and there's all sorts of fantastical things. There's history in there, but it's misleading to say historians and classicists just trust Plutarch here.
So, yeah, we all think Alexander was born of a snake. We just don't. And so it's sort of like, I try to be fair as I possibly can. Back to kind of the beginning of our conversation, like, how can I treat these things the way we treat other kinds of literature from the same period or thereabouts? We're very measured in what we're willing to accept about claims, about people's places and individuals, when we don't have that personal investment on wanting to know exactly what is historical. The thing that's always interesting to me, and we can continue to talk about Plutarch too, but it's almost like the stakes are so high for claims about the historical Jesus that's why people get really sort of fixated on the idea of this must be true, or he must have said this, or he, which is the authoritative account, even though the Gospels actually, even the Synoptic Gospels, don't really even tell the same story about Jesus. Matthew and Luke have different birth narratives. But we seem to hang more on that, more consequence on that. And we want those texts to conform to contemporary ideas of what history telling mean. And I don't think that the text can do that. It's kind of that square peg round hole problem, because the authors were not bound by those same kind of standards of history telling, or, giving a nonfiction account of something. They really were there to kind of give you an impression of a figure, or make it more of kind of a moral or ethical story to think about, than to give you the tools to then draw longer and later theological conclusions that would have all kinds of implications for law, for, etc. It's just not what was going on for these authors in the first century. And, for good reason. It's very difficult to confirm any kind of story in the ancient world, because life expectancy is short. Not that many people can read. You don't have easy ways to confirm or deny any kind of claim. And so it's just, the infrastructure is not there. And the expectations that we have for these texts were just not there in antiquity.
I interviewed Dr. Craig Keener, and we talked about the speeches in Acts and their authenticity. And he and Dr. Michael Licona, and from them, I realized virtually all scholars agree that ancient standards of historiography are different from typical modern standards. And especially with speeches, the historiographer or the writer would try to convey some kind of moral message or their own theology, or a lot of scholars would also say the theology of their community, which you would disagree with, but they try to express that through the speeches, and Dr. Keener acknowledges that. But with respect to the reliability of Acts and the speeches in general and the Gospels in general, it comes out conservative with respect to the reliability of their accounts. And this is because a lot of conservative people say the Gospels consistently get various specific historical details right about arguments within Judaism between Pharisees and Sadducees and peasants and elites, and bodies of water, and whether not just place names but obscure towns, and whether they're going up or down from someone, or east or west, and so on. Even the specifics in what city officials were called, because there were lots of different names, and then archaeology confirms. And I know this is just a standard apologetic argument, but I'm curious if you agree that the Gospels get a lot of historical details right, and if so, what the implications of that are, or if because from the look on your face, it seems like you deny that. And you'd say that maybe these are just like myths that consistently situate their stories in historical places.
Well, it's hard because so if you're it's always a little bit idiosyncratic to me what people decide to call historical fact versus non-historical fact. So do you all, not you, but like we also are dealing with, say, in the Gospels, stories about a demon going into pigs and hurling them off a cliff, and in Acts, there's Acts of the Apostles. There are many other Acts, Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example. But in a lot of these stories, there are things like talking dogs, angels helping people escape out of prison, like these very fantastic stories. And so it's always a little strange to me. So the reason I go like, I don't know how to distinguish between like, oh, so he got Capernaum right here. But, then there's a talking dog. It's like, it's hard for me as a historian to look at those things and pass judgment on anyone, because I think if you're a person of faith, then you read the text as a person of faith. But again, it kind of comes down to what do you want this text to do, right? Now, it's certainly the case. I think you were probably referencing the Gospel of John, where there are some archaeological sites that are described, and then John seems to, have some kind of things have been found that, I'm thinking there about the pool, right, and John. Yeah, exactly. Which is really exciting, I think, and really, really interesting, especially because scholars tend to date John really late, right? And so there's a piece of really interesting data to contend with. I think that's fabulous, but it's also the case we can tell that John's out of order. Jesus will say, why doesn't anybody ask me why I go to, this town when he's just come from that town? There's actually a whole bunch of different theories about why that is. There's one called the Boltzmann displacement theory, that a scribe actually tripped and like dropped the document and then like shuffled it back together and it was all out of order. So these things are like it's like endless. You can continue to argue for and against, and everybody on, people on either side are going to have their claim versus the other person's claim. We don't even have to go to things like talking dogs and angels. I've been pregnant. I don't want to go on a donkey for like a 60-kilometer ride when I'm 8 months pregnant. Like, that doesn't sound like a real story to me, right? And that whole like worldwide census, we know that never happened. All of the leaders are wrong. They're like close to the date, but it's not quite like, so-and-so was not the governor of Syria at the time. Joseph, I don't even think, would pay taxes. He doesn't appear to be a citizen, nor was there any census that would force you to go back to your homeland. Like, all of that's just writerly stuff from what I can tell. So I feel like that conversation would end up becoming endless. And it just comes back to that initial thing that I mentioned a couple of questions ago, which is, it's more about what we're trying to get out of the text ourselves that maybe the text can't supply, or we have to ask ourselves, why do we care? Because if you're a person of faith, does it really matter if Mary rode on the donkey or not? Right? Does it really matter whose birth narrative is correct? Does it really matter if Jesus went to particular towns or not? And isn't it exciting when something is confirmed? Because let's take that as evidence of thinking about how these texts were produced, rather than as, weaponizing it for kind of having arguments with one another. So that's more or less my opinion on the matter.